Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's 1 minute past 1, so good afternoon and welcome to today's event entitled After the Levelling Up Bill, What Next for Planning Reform? I think planning elicits more debate than probably any other issue that we look at the Centre for Cities. So I'm hoping the event will be both fun as well as informative. Plenty to discuss with lots of strongly held views on different sides. 2 bits of context just so we get sort of rules of the game. We're primarily interested in the system and not so much about the individuals or the individual local authorities that work within it and are part of it. So I think we want to think about the system and how that works rather than the actions of individuals within the system, because they are responding to the system they find themselves in. And then I think the second bit of context is that we need to recognize the obvious point that planning is inherently political as well as being a technical discipline. And we need to understand and recognize that the politics of this as well as getting into the detail of the technicalities of how the system actually functions. So 2 of those, 2 sort of overriding bits of context for today. And we've got a great panel to explore the issues, give us a heads up as to where we are and where we might be going. But before we do that, we've got a panel, we've got a poll question, sorry, that we'd like the audience to answer. In a moment, the question will appear on the screen. It's a straightforward yes, no, and you get about 15 to 20 seconds to reply, and then we'll reveal the answer and then I'll introduce our panel. So if we can have the first question, and the first question is very simply, you have one choice. Is the current UK planning system fit for purpose? It's a big question. There's lots of nuance in it, but for the purposes of clarity, we're just going to do yes, no. So if you can vote now, or it should be voting, and then we'll get the answers in a few seconds, and then I'll introduce my panel. Okay, let's get the results. Is it fit for purpose? No, 85% of those that voted said that it isn't fit for purpose, and a brave 15% said it was. In the Q&A, which you can put your questions and comments to the panel throughout, it'd be interesting to get those that say it is and those that say it isn't. You might want to give some reason as to that, as well as any other questions that you've got based on what you're going to hear from the panel. So let me introduce the panel and let's get underway with them. So the first panelist is Anthony Breach. Anthony is Senior Analyst at the Centre for Cities and leads on all our housing and planning research work. Our second panelist is Tom Dobson. Tom is Managing Director of Quod, which is a leading planning and development consultancy. And our third panelist is Jenny Schuetz, who's a Senior Fellow at Brookings Metro and specialises in urban economics and housing policy. And Jenny particularly is going to bring an outsider and international perspective to the conversation today. In the usual way, each of them will get a few minutes to set out their stall on some of the big questions and issues, particularly where we are currently with the process from Tom and from Anthony, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So, Anthony, over to you.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you, Andrew. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about sort of the political context about planning reform in the UK, some of the imminent reforms that are on the table and are being discussed at the moment, and also talking about a little bit about the long-term future of planning reform and the planning system in the UK, particularly within England. So obviously, I think, you know, with a lot of kind of the ongoing debate and discussion that happens today, I think can often be missed that planning reform has been on the agenda for a long time. So I wouldn't want to presuppose if there's anyone on the call who remembers the Barker Review back in 2004, 2006, whereas became a major element of government policy was improving housing outcomes through reforming the planning system. Obviously, about a decade ago, we had the introduction of the National Planning Policy Framework and subsequent revisions to it since, which is a major reform that's associated with an increase in house building over the past decade. And most recently, we've had the Planning White Paper back in 2020, the Levelling Up Bill, and the new the consultation going out on the changes to the NPPF, which are probably the most significant since it was introduced a decade ago. So on the one hand, we've been talking about it for a long time, but it's probably also now higher on the political agenda than it has ever been. So it's more divisive, certainly in national politics, than it was 10, 15 years ago. But there's also momentum happening in the rest of the world. So pretty much most parts of the English-speaking world are grappling with similar problems and are making headway on some of these issues. I'm sure Jenny is going to tell us a little bit more about those later on in the event. Now, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of the NPPF consultation. Maybe we can take some specific questions later on specific reforms. But I do want to talk a little bit now about kind of the trade-offs that the government seems to be grappling with and what that says about the future of the planning system. I think it's probably fair to say that the reaction to the NPPF consultation that's been put out over the past, back in December, just before Christmas, has been broadly negative among planning commentators and kind of in the development community. I think within those is kind of, I think you can get like a silhouette of what the government is trying to achieve with some of these reforms and some of the constraints that it's facing. So on the one hand, it's kind of, you can see that the government is trying to both introduce more certainty in the planning process with the introduction of the national development management policies and little tweaks such as making it easier to build mansard roofs. On the other hand, you can also see that the government is also removing sticks from the planning process. So such as things like the weakening of the housing delivery test and also removal of the duty to cooperate between local authorities. You can see that some of those sticks, which kind of currently keep housing supply quite high, are being removed. You can also see they're trying to make the planning system more plan-led. So trying to make it easier for local authorities to agree local plans, taking away some of the burdens and producing enormous amounts of evidence to justify them and prove that the plans are sound. But at the same time, you can see that they are also trying to reduce the land supply. That's kind of going into the planning systems as a trade-off there. So taking away the land supply buffers in the housing delivery test, increasing the weights given to farmland and protecting the green belt more. But you can also see kind of, I think, to take a more strategic picture, you can see that the government is aware that there is a housing crisis and that there is a housing shortage. So you can see in some of the ideas around increasing the importance of housing and infrastructure in the introduction to the NPPF document, but also you can see how the decreased emphasis on the 300,000 a year target and making densification of the suburbs more difficult also indicates that they're facing a backlash in terms of the politics of development from opponents and from political groups that oppose new housing. So I think some of the trade-offs that the government is making here, I think, are somewhat reasonable. Others are less reasonable. But I think the overarching problem here is that the planning system in England is really highly restrictive on development on the face of it. And therefore, to get the system to function in any reasonable way, to even get close to meeting England's needs for development, there needs to be loads of carrots and there needs to be loads of sticks to get the system to function, to get planning permissions out and to get development underway. The problem is, and that's part of why kind of getting local plans agreed is so important and allocating land for development. The problem is with a carrot and stick system is that some people don't like carrots. So it doesn't matter how many carrots you offer, or if you offer the biggest carrot in the whole wide world, if they hate carrots, they're not going to bite. And so I think we can see with this political problem that the government is facing, where they're both trying to solve the housing crisis, but also trying to mitigate some of the backlash to some of the sticks, you are going to be facing these same trade-offs within the current planning system, unless the planning system is reformed and replaced with something else at a future date. So my current sense is that the NPPF changes at present, just purely looking at the face of it in terms of the document, I think would probably reduce the amount of development that happens within England, with kind of the knock-on effects that would result. So we'd probably see a worsening housing shortage, probably see greater misallocation of housing, probably greater inequality in housing outcomes, and reduce kind of economic growth, etc. And so I think there's therefore two lessons to draw from this, one in the short term and then one in the long term. So I think in the short term, it means in the context of the document that the government really has to both remove some of the things that they've introduced in the consultation that are a little bit silly. So such as things that, having a test based on character for planning applications. Planning permissions are based on, improvements to the land itself. It's nothing to do with the applicant, and introducing that kind of test would really weaken the planning system in quite significant ways. But I think it also means in the short term, the government has to be making sure that the elements where they are trying to make the system a bit more plan-led, a bit more certain, they really have to be quite robust on that. So the role of the national development management policies is going to be really important going forward. And the government needs to bear that in mind if they do want to make some of these compromises around the housing delivery test and around land supply. But I think in the long term, if we really want to escape these kind of trade-offs between carrots and sticks from the current system, which makes the system very confrontational, very aggro, and very delivers poor housing outcomes, we really do need to think about moving away from our current discretionary case-by-case planning system, where even if you propose something that complies with the local plan, it can still be rejected by the local authority, by officers or by councillors. And so I think the end idea would be moving away from that towards a more rules-based, what we said, a flexible zoning system, where instead if you follow the rules, then you can build. I think in practice, that means moving towards a system where local plans and local transport plans are merged into the same document. So we move from town planning towards kind of more spatial planning. But I think so long as planning reform stays on the agenda, and we keep seeing good examples from abroad, and we keep seeing kind of government attention on this, I'm pretty confident that within the planning system 10 years from now will be better than the planning system that we have at present.
Excellent, a very good optimistic bit to end on your introductory comments, and very good. Tom, are you suitably optimistic? Also, just give us your view of where you think we are in terms of the system and what's going on within it, and the arguments that are being made for more extensive or less extensive reform.
Thanks, Andrew. I've spent the last couple of days ruminating on how I fit this into 3 minutes, because I think anyone involved in the industry at the moment could give you an hour-long tirade about their views on the current system and the current reforms. But I mean, I think we've gone through a really kind of hectic and erratic 2-year period since the 2019 general election. So we started off with a kind of heroic phase of reform. Dominic Cummings, move fast, break things. Planning white paper was going to tear down the system and start again. Then we had the kind of initial tactical withdrawal from the so-called mutant algorithm. Then we got the levelling up and regeneration bill, which was actually, I think, probably agree with that. There's a kind of series of sensible and relatively narrow reforms in there, but things that could work. And then we got the parliamentary revolt and the proposed changes that are already seeing authorities across the country withdrawing and changing plans. Some may get them adopted quicker if what's being suggested is beneficial for them to do that in the short term. So I think we'll have to see how that plays out. But in general, I think it is certainly at the moment a kind of shock to the system that's slowing things down. Overall, in terms of a kind of industry response, I think there's a kind of, as much as anything, a bemusement at the outcome of a process that no one in the industry really asked for. No one was begging for any of this in 2019. You could argue that's because the industry currently are kind of insiders who are benefiting from the current system, and the whole kind of disruption argument was in part about that. And I think that reflects kind of two different philosophies to reform. So the philosophy that we got from the 2019 white paper was almost the kind of asteroid hitting the Earth, changing the entire system, and then the dinosaurs dying out, and a new breed of developers coming in to change the whole world. I suppose the other thing that you could contrast that with is the whole kind of idea of marginal gains, tightening everything up, looking at how you improve the system over time, which is what's been happening since 2010. And I think there have been a lot of benefits from that. So if you look at the NPPF, Ant mentioned this, but planning permissions from the peak before the great financial crash, about 260,000 a year, up to about 400,000 a year. A couple of years ago, they've been slowing down a bit over the last year or so. But in a sense, we've had a lot more planning permissions. We haven't had a lot more development. Peak to peak, we're pretty similar, gone up a little bit. And then we're not talking about infrastructure planning here, but that's kind of part of the same thing. And I think, again, the 2008 Act is generally seen to have improved things significantly, and improved things on kind of timing and process. And I think the other thing I'd say is planning is a barrier, clearly, to delivery of increased housing and, in some cases, better development and increased infrastructure, but it's far from the only one. And there are significant issues around capacity. There's significant issues about finance and project management. We work on everything from the planning for the Olympic Park to nuclear power stations, and there is a hell of a lot of stuff that isn't planning around the timing and delivery of those things. In terms of what's needed, and I mean, I'm inclined now, after our move fast and break things and never waste a good crisis and all of the other metaphors that people in politics have liked using to try and do rapid and significant reform in very short periods of time, that maybe a long-term view and some steady focused improvement wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Advice to a minister would be, do you really need more primary legislation? You can go a long way with policy. The interesting thing about the NPPF reforms is that actually Michael Gove, in order to get his backbenchers on side to vote for the bill, actually changed a load of policy and barely changed the bill. You can do quite a lot through policy as a minister, and you'll be able to do more with the changes to National Development Management Policy in the legislation. So how you do that sensibly. The levelling up bill, local plans, national policy, stuff like that, all good. I think there's a lot of potential benefit from that. We need to continue to have a mechanism to ensure that land is allocated, and not just the kind of planning Goldilocks minimum amount that you can get away with. We need surplus probably isn't the right word, but we need more land than you would plan for to meet that minimum amount in order for competition to work, in order to shake up the market, have different developers coming in and things like that. So it's not about planning for the minimum. Stop loading more and more requirements onto the system. We keep doing that, more and more burdens. And that's linked to Ant's point about simplifying the system and getting things through quicker. If we can reduce that and get smaller developments, particularly through in a way that is around meeting some very clear standards, I think that is clearly something we should be doing. Whether we need to blow up the whole system to do that, I'm less sure. Be really careful with the levy. I might come back to that because I'm obsessed with it, but I won't dwell on that at this particular point. I think planners and people in the system need to be less wedded to the current system. There's an obsession with control rather than necessarily about outcomes, and I think there are examples where we can have more flexibility and more liberalisation as opposed to deregulation without undermining quality. Jenny might be kind of commenting on some of that in a minute, because as Ant regularly points out in his blogs, we're the only country with a system like this. So there clearly are things to learn from other places. And lastly, I think the other thing that's going to come over the hill is carbon. And it's going to be the policy area for our times. The current debates about embodied carbon, the government legislating for binding targets. Unless the government's clear about how the planning system should deal with that, there's a real danger of a whole load of more things being piled on that the planning system can't cope with, rather than being part of a system that does actually help the net zero strategy. So that's where
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom. I'll come to Jenny in 1 second. Tom, just your initial quick thought on, you talked a little bit about, back to 2019 and this kind of quite revolutionary sort of perspective, which was to break it all and almost start again. And then there's been, over the preceding or the following period, there's, a lot of that stuff has been removed or sidelined. Do you think that's primarily politics coming to bear, or do you think there are kind of good technical reasons for what was proposed, say, in 19 don't make sense once you actually get into the detail of them? How should we think about some of the big changes that the government has then not done over the last 2 to 3 years?
Well, I suppose the first starting point on that is that if you look at the British administrative system, British government, the two things that are least changed since 1947 are the NHS and the town and country planning system. So it is resilient, and it's resilient because it was a triangulation of people who didn't want building in the countryside, and at that time people who wanted more development in the north of England and the depressed areas. That may sound familiar to some of the people listening now, but that kind of triangulation and compromise has given the planning system a very kind of solid political grounding that's really difficult for anyone to change. I think the other aspect of it is doing that radical change after that period. Is that radical change and the pain and process you go through with trying to do that and slowing things down and blowing things up and everything else actually is the benefit at the end of that? going to be significant enough for what you kind of lose out on in that period of transition. And there are more or less discretionary systems. This argument about discretion versus zoning has existed since bylaw housing in the early 20th century. So this isn't a kind of, that isn't a new debate either, really. So there are those kind of technical things, but I think it is rooted in the founders of the town planning system as it is were very savvy about how to buy off two ends of a political spectrum.
Very good. Excellent. Okay. So, Jenny, you are our internationalist and outsider. As both Tom and Anthony said, you know, we have a peculiarly and slightly strange idiosyncratic system. Give us, how does it look from your end, and where else should we be looking to think about, you know, reforms on the micro or the macro scale?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think Ant teed it up nicely that this question between how much is it a rules-based system versus a discretionary system is really at the heart of the issue. And, you know, all countries are somewhere in between. You know, towards the very rules-based are countries like Germany, where the process is really set out. You know, they also devolve planning authority to local governments, but local governments produce a pretty clear set of rules. X amount of land allows housing at such and such a density, and this land is set aside for commercial. The standards for both building safety and for land use and development. But it is very much a rules-based system, and once those are set, the process of developers getting permission to change a piece of land from one thing to another to build is very straightforward. And the decisions are largely made by planning staff without a lot of public weigh-in, and so it's a fairly transparent process. The US is somewhere in the middle, and it varies a lot across locations. So the growth-friendly places, you know, a lot of the suburban areas outside of Texas, the Sunbelt areas, those also tend to be pretty rules-based. Here's the amount of land on which you can build a certain use. And I will say a lot of the places tend to give rules-based and very clear process for building single-family detached homes and kind of a traditional subdivision. In greenfields development, infill tends to be more complicated. So the bias is it's very easy and straightforward to build 1,000 single-family homes in a brand new subdivision that's very car-oriented. If you want to build an apartment building in an infill location, say changing over commercial or a parking lot or something, that generally has to go through a discretionary process, but there is something that has to be guaranteed that you can do as of right. And that's partly required under the Constitution so that you know, the government allows you to do something with your property. The places in the US that are really facing the tightest housing crunch are the places that are much more discretionary. So if we look at places like California and New York, they have a much more complicated process, much less transparent. You do a lot more one-off negotiations between the developer and the government, and that is in fact the problem. That's where there are too many veto points in the process. It's hard to get things through. So, you know, I would recommend as much as you can do a rules-based process with the caveat that the rules have to be reasonable. So if all of the land is zoned in advance for very low density housing, that doesn't in fact buy you very much. You know, I think the second question that hasn't really come up so far is what are the financial incentives, particularly for local governments and local residents, in allowing new development? So we do know that when you build more homes and more people move in, that it does create some demand on public services, right? This may be more kids going to schools. It may be more demands on the public transit system. You may need upgrades to water and sewer systems and so forth. So there are real implications for providing these services. Countries have very different approaches to funding this. So, you know, there's inherently a tie between local governments that control land use. If they also have to pay for public services, they need to have ways to fund that. So can local governments raise sales taxes or property taxes or impose user fees? And are those sufficient to cover the costs of additional services? You know, so a country like France, for instance, provides a lot more federal funding. You know, the entire school system is funded federally. So if you build more homes and more kids need to go to school, the federal government just provides the money for this. And it takes away some of the fiscal opposition from local governments and residents because they know that this is not a cost. My understanding is that the UK has much less local discretion over fiscal policy. You know, so whether that's on the table to devolve some of it might make sense. And then finally, I'll just say this is inherently political. Getting your elected officials to vote for changes to the planning system depends on them feeling like their constituents will support these decisions. And so the pro-housing movement, not just in the US, but in the UK and a number of other countries, I think has rightly been focused on raising broad public awareness of the costs of underbuilding, why this is really hindering the economy, how this hurts local economies, particularly some of the generational imbalances that this brings up. But ultimately, you have to make a persuasive case to enough voters that elected officials feel comfortable doing this. And once you start building momentum, that this is really a problem for most of us, I think tying it to some of the climate issues is also useful. It becomes much easier to persuade your elected officials. So don't forget the Hearts and Minds campaign.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I've got a quick question for you, Jenny, and for those listening, if you've got questions or comments, put them in the Q&A and I'll get to them and weave them into the conversation. Jenny, both Tom and Anne said, in a sense that the British system is both relatively stable on the one hand. It's been around since, in it primarily, but not, with modification since 47, but also that reform modification is also going on, almost continuously. So both a stable system, but also lots changing within it, if that's possible. But I think it is. I mean, are there other countries, other systems that you're looking at that are similarly, in this kind of almost consistent process of change, modification, or do you find that, in a sense, the systems are in place and they relatively function unchanged?
So not that many countries have done really large-scale change their whole approach to housing production. I will point one nice example of reform that we should all be looking at. New Zealand, about a year ago, passed a pretty broad reform that allowed moderate density housing in most of the large cities. So this is particularly aimed at the Auckland metro area, but in major cities now, you can build, I believe it's up to 3 homes per parcel of land and up to 3 stories as of right, so under a rules-based system. So that increases sort of the baseline of what you're allowed to do. New Zealand is the first country that I know of that did a national level planning and zoning reform that affected sort of the whole country. Other places have been doing state level reforms or local reforms. The US has a lot of state level reforms going on at the moment. Our federal government has very limited legal authority over this, so changes really have to come from states. It's most of the countries that are feeling the pinch of housing costs are talking about changes, but generally tweaks within the broad system. Including almost every country devolves a lot of authority to local governments to do this. And I think that's going to be very difficult to claw back. In some sense, that would make it easier, but it's hard to take back authority from local entities because they have so much invested in this. So the question then is, can you offer financial carrots and sticks that change their incentives while still allowing them the discretion to set their own rules? And again, countries vary a lot in what kind of redistribution they're already doing and what they're allowed to do to change the fiscal incentives.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much for that. So we've had some questions coming in, and I'll try and weave them into the conversation. Tom, maybe start with you and get Anne to come in. You said towards the end about the purpose of the planning system, and back in 47 it was both an urban containment, countryside preservation type of broad big purpose. But you also said that more and more expectations have been put onto the planning system to do X or to do Y. I mean, in a sense, how should we think about the system and its fit for purpose in the 21st century? Tom, it's a big question, but are we still clear as to what it is that we actually wanted to be doing, and is that still relevant to what we actually need as a country?
I don't think we're necessarily clear about what we want it to be doing, and the Rainsford review a few years back pointed that out. In fact, most people who look at the system point that out. Although I'm also a bit skeptical about whether there's ever going to be a simple answer to that question, going back to the politics and everything else. Yeah. Urban containment, the interesting thing about urban containment and the green belt, back to my point about policy, is that that's not in legislation at all. That's been done through policy all the way through, so it's got that kind of role. We've had a lot of wider reviews and other things. There was Barker, there was the Urban Task Force, there are various things, and obviously the Better Building Beautiful Commission and the work that they've been doing. So there's been lots of work about content and lots of quite good work about content, I think. But in terms of the kind of layering things on, I think the problem is planning does have that wider role, the kind of placemaking role and so on, but it also has a regulatory function as to how much of a factor of production can be used to deliver something essential for everyone who lives in the country. And the balance between those things and how it strikes them, I don't think is necessarily kind of great. But also, if you're putting in a development of, say, 200 apartments or something now, you've got so many different assessments to do, many of which don't influence or affect what the outcome is. They're just going through the motions. And I say this as someone who runs a consultancy that churns some of this stuff out, but you've got huge environmental statements. I think some of the evidence from the US is that to some extent a lot of this kind of process stuff doesn't actually have kind of beneficial effects and actually can slow things down, including very environmentally beneficial things like green infrastructure and so on. But every time something happens, there's a new thing kind of placed on the system. So we've seen recently fire safety. We absolutely need fire safety. Grenfell was an unforgivable tragedy, but is the planning system the best place to then be putting something about fire safety reports, or should this be about the kind of building codes and basic kind of binary yes or no, this works, this doesn't? It's not part of a planning balance. So we keep kind of, whenever there's a problem, politicians, I think partly because it doesn't have any direct financial expenditure consequences kind of for them, then just pile that additional thing because they can write it as a line of policy that someone has to do or produce without it being paid for. But in the end, that clogs up the system and slows everything down and asks planning to answer questions that it's not very good at answering.
Yeah, that's super good. And coming on this, there's sort of the need or the desire for simplification, but it also goes against increasing complication and extra requirements put onto the system. And I'll bring Jenny in on that as well.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think that's I agree with Tom that the current system is trying to do too many things, and also that most people who look at the English system would agree that it's trying to do too many things. I think one thing where there's maybe perhaps a surprising amount of consensus within the current reforms the government is doing is this move towards digitization and having more map-based planning. Because one thing that's striking about the way local plans currently work is local plans are not really map-based, right? They're not spatial. It's a long list of policies, like a checklist, in which individual developments are checked against with a very minimal kind of spatial element. So I think this is kind of I think if we were to move towards a more zoning-based system in which rules were decided whether by central government or by local government and then applied within the local authority, maybe setting aside some land for agricultural or greenbelt-ish uses and setting other land urban uses and deciding how that can be used, we can then at the very least solve the basic problem of town planning, which is how do we match up development to increased infrastructure needs that development brings. I think at a baseline minimum, we should be trying to get a system which can do that, because the current system really struggles even to do that. And then we can start thinking about, well, okay, what are the other priorities that we want to layer on top of that system, in terms of whether that's carbon, whether that's, equality, with securing access to green space. But I think we should, we can have a debate about those things, and those things are important. But there's the basic task of supplying abundant and sufficient high quality housing that the current system is really failing to do. Until we get that basic right, I think it's really challenging to say, oh, let's pile on more duties onto the planning system, let's get it to do more stuff when it's already struggling.
Great, we'll come on to that in a second, because I want to get, again, your kind of perspectives on the different types of the different development pressures as they play out in different parts of the country. So I'll come back to you on that in a second, Ant and Tom. But Jenny, just on this complication versus simplification, again, when you're looking at systems elsewhere, can we see broad trends around, more complicated, less complicated, desire for simplification? How would you enter into that kind of bit of the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly been an international trend also towards layering more things on top of planning and zoning. And I think it's worth remembering that the tools of land use planning are better at constraining bad things from happening than in encouraging or mandating good things to happen. So it's a mechanism for stopping stuff. And part of this, I think, is how planners are trained, which is actually remarkably consistent across countries, that planners do have this sense of, it is my job to envision and then lay out prescriptions for what we want to see, rather than it is not my job to hinder the market doing what it wants to do. And so these layers of land use, building safety, fire safety, environmental protections, do we have inclusion in there for affordable housing, for special kinds of uses? The idea is somehow that the planner's job is to create this perfect city and then set out the rules to create it. As an economist who works in the land use space, this is very bizarre, because the economist rule is we should explicitly block things that are bad, right? So we have a set of tools to block, for instance, environmentally polluting or damaging actions. Why do we need to also build that into the planning and zoning code, right? We have a set of rules that we can use around nuisances. We can use those separately. Public health provides us with tools for health and safety. And so in some sense, planning has been asked to carry the load of a lot of different policy areas, which means that you then have lots of different experts and this sort of layering of many, many reviews and many voices weighing in. I think part of this would be if we could train planners to think of their job differently. Their job is not to get in the way and to facilitate good things, rather than to think of a worst case scenario and then try to stop that. I think we might make more progress.
Brilliant. Tom, come back in on this. You could talk about how we train planners if you want, but I suppose, there's a broader point about what it is we should expect the planning system to be doing. How many conditions or objectives should we give it? And you rightly said, we just load more and more expectations on it, which ultimately, makes it much more difficult as a system to function. So is simplification sort of a strategic objective, do you think?
I think it is. I think it's kind of simplification in the context of government and local government being able and willing to take on more of that role. That's a kind of role proactively of government. And one of the things we've done over the last kind of 30 or 40 years is almost government's thrown up its hands and delegated to developers and planning applicants to do all of these various different things, often to standards and requirements that government isn't able to willing or fund itself. But one of the things that, looking at kind of the levy and the local plan and all of those kind of things, local government actually being able to and empowered to step up and take that role means that it can then say to the developer, this is your small part of that and these are the rules around it, rather than you almost have a plan for every social aspect and social, environmental and economic sustainability of your development. If government's setting those things out, which it does more in some European countries, that takes the pressure off the planning system, allows you to have the good things, but it also allows you to simplify.
Yeah, and
yeah, sure. I think it's totally the case that the current planning system is too complicated and it should be simpler. I think this also comes back a little bit to what Jenny was saying also about funding, right? That we in the UK know that funding in the UK is incredibly centralised, that there are very poor incentives for local government to pursue development, but it's also that the structure of local government in the UK, because it's so fragmented, and with housing, local plans being done at a district level, and transport and infrastructure, and crucially social care funding, which is the big outlay of local government, it's done at the upper tier, the county council level. You have a complete misalignment of incentives between the district and then the county council. And so if you're pushing on new responsibilities onto districts and local plans to kind of come up with all of these things that ultimately they're not bothered about, right? That ultimately, that whether they sort of have more growth is neither here nor there to their funding situation. You can have this bizarre situation where more houses being built would increase funding a little bit for a part of local government that really needs more funding, but actually the local government body making those decisions is actually disconnected from any of the upside and the downside from financially from development, but is very exposed to the local politics of anti-development and of the competing responsibilities placed on it by central government.
Brilliant. Okay, that's really helpful. Let's turn to we've had sort of several questions on this issue around variable sort of development pressures in different parts of the country and how the system does or doesn't respond to that. Maybe start with you again, Tom. In a sense, very crudely, some parts of the country, extreme development pressures. We see that, in the desire, for land prices, market signals telling us, that demand is very strong in some parts of the country. In other parts of the country, demand is much weaker. And so there's a different type of challenge. How should we, how do we think about that? But also, how does the planning system, how does it currently, and how should it respond to the kind of variability across place and space?
Well, we've obviously got the very different, as you say, the very different kind of price signals and historic kind of development trends and demographic trends as well in different areas in terms of kind of those price pressures compared to the amount of housing that's built. It's the hinterlands of more or less the green belt. Not everywhere has a green belt, but the hinterlands of labour markets, basically. So the London green belt, the Leeds green belt, the York green belt, Manchester and so on. Strong demand, obviously, in the centre of big cities, always been kind of strong demand as well. Lower demand in some areas, although the interesting thing is the correlation between not necessarily objectively assessed need, but the actual building isn't very strong. So you actually get quite a lot of homes built in what would be seen as some of the weaker housing markets, which is partly the result of the planning system pushing them beyond the green belt, out of the green belt and so on, which is probably both an environmentally and economically inefficient outcome. So that's kind of how the process has been working. Price signals were built into this kind of objectively assessed need mechanism and were kind of beefed up in the so-called mutant algorithm. So the numbers increased significantly in the kind of home counties and some of the kind of greenbelt areas, which was one of the reasons why there was then the huge backlash to it, because those areas are tend to be represented by Conservative MPs who weren't entirely pleased about what their government was proposing around that. So we then got the kind of backlash to it, and the new system has reduced that and sought to push the kind of need and therefore the housing kind of numbers that you need to be starting with much more back into larger cities. But what we also see from a lot of those larger cities is there isn't necessarily the demand, and particularly the discussion about family housing versus apartments is interesting. And as someone who grew up in a flat, families do sometimes live in flats, but by and large in this country, people want to bring up their families in houses, and the system at the moment, if it's pushing everything into apartments in the cities, is I think missing quite a large market segment, quite apart from the fact that some of those cities are very constrained as well. So I think that where we are at the moment is pushing against addressing some of those needs and issues.
And is that, do you think that's because the national system can't deal with the sort of variability, and or localities themselves are not able to fully kind of deal with the circumstances they find themselves in, or don't have the incentives to deal with the conditions that they find themselves in? I mean, Tom, where's your sort of?
I think if you look at the kind of different places, the big cities by and large have sought to meet the need that they've been given in the past and have delivered quite strongly. The other kind of interesting location is the Oxford, what was called the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, which the planning status has been taken away, but actually there's been a load of development in the Oxford-Cambridge corridor. It's been one of the strongest areas, and that's because it's pushed beyond the metropolitan green belt. So that area, the kind of Bedfordshire, South Midlands, etc., has seen quite significant housing development, and maybe hasn't had the kind of strategic planning, infrastructure planning to make that work better, and looking at those kind of different networks and so on. But I think it's kind of quite variable around the country. But if you're looking at the need and the high value areas, it's the green belt, and it's not that they don't have the capacity to cope with it, it's that by and large residents don't want it.
Yeah, no, quite. Jenny, come to you on this. Other systems that better or worse in sort of dealing with the variability of development pressures, across space and place. You mentioned California having a particularly difficult system to manage and to get stuff done. It's also one of the places where development pressures, at least in certain parts of it, are very, very high, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really odd that we see the places with highest demand are consistently the ones that have the most strict regulations, and so they underbuild. And the places that have relatively weak demand are open to development. They're often looking for economic growth. They want to make themselves attractive, so they have relatively loose permissions. But planning, again, does not do a good job at pushing economic growth or encouraging economic growth. And so allowing houses in a place where the market can't build, where construction costs are higher than the rents or the prices they will get, it is not effective. And so, sometimes I think there's a tendency for planners to want to use their land use control as a means of economic development. And historically, that's just not been very effective, right? So that's not the way to generate growth. But I think this question of, do you allow people who live in really high value places to veto development where incoming residents want to come, gets at one of the fundamental problems that allowing the current people who can afford to live someplace to block new residents coming in is almost always going to be a problem. And I think in the UK and certainly in the US as well, we see some of this is just generational. People bought homes in places that are now high value, that are really very affluent. They bought at a time when that was a middle class neighborhood, and they still think of themselves as middle class. So they're sort of resistant to the idea that they are sitting on very expensive land that is not used well for its current land value. And somehow you need to push out, not exactly push people out, but you need to encourage people to think about future generations and future development, even though they have no incentive to do that. We on the issue of family-sized housing, across many developed countries, we have really similar demographic trends. There was this huge population growth with the baby boomers who are now aging. We have a very fast growth of older households. Most of them are one or at most two-person households, and many of them are sitting in 3- and 4-bedroom homes that they don't actually need, but they have no incentive to move into a smaller space. And so the family-size housing is occupied by non-families, and younger families with kids are living in smaller spaces because that's what they can afford. The way to address this is really to make people pay for the value of the land that they're sitting on, but there's an enormous political resistance to pressuring particularly older households to downsize, move out, even though frankly we need to be doing more of that.
Yeah, no, very good, very good. And give us a quick thought on this issue, because there's a couple of others I want to get to as well.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, we definitely see in the UK this kind of mismatch between local demand, local supply. Like the planning system, because it's so restrictive, seems to disconnect those two things, and the result is kind of almost this like replication of existing stock, like where there are already houses, the same number, like the same share of houses as that place already has, is then added to the existing stock. So lower demand places are building roughly as much, maybe even slightly more than places that are much higher demand, which is really inefficient. And I think, one of the arguments you often see in the UK is that, actually, we need to build many more houses in poor parts of the country to encourage economic development, when we know that the actual underlying economic fundamentals of a place aren't driven by how many houses are available in that particular area, but what the skills mix in the area, what the quality of the exporters, what's the quality of the city centre and commercial space in these cities. I think, and especially as after 30 years now of kind of brownfield regeneration policy being pursued in the UK, we're simply now running out of brownfield land, especially within London. That the industrial land in London is now more expensive than residential land. And ultimately, London in particular is now facing a crisis where to continue supplying houses, even at quite low rates, which has been building in them, we're going to start needing to think about greenbelt reform and loosening those constraints and actually correcting those spatial imbalances in housing supply across the country.
Okay, very good. Tom, come back to you, and Jenny, maybe with you, Jenny, first, because we've had a bit of pushback on some of the comments in the Q&A that you've offered a sort of very de minimalist view of planning, in the sense of, you know, do no harm, and then leave all the creativity and the wonderfulness to, you know, to others to kind of figure out. Whereas we've had quite a few saying surely planning is all about sustainability and beauty and, you know, creating good places and great neighborhoods, etc. So defend your sort of de minimis position on planning, Jen. I get Tom to come in on this as well, because we do hear this a lot, right? This is partly about what is it that we think planning should or could be doing. This is at the heart of it, and some believe it should be doing an awful lot, which is, you know, manifests itself in lots of different slogans like 15-minute cities and all of that kind of stuff that we hear a lot about in various guises. But defend your de minimis position, Jenny.
I'm all for planners creating beautiful places and integrating commercial uses and creating 15-minute cities, as long as they are not stopping the fundamental need of enough housing at a price that most people can afford. And I would say that so far, the planning profession has done better at placemaking in sort of a very precious small scale way than they have at just allowing people to have access to housing close to jobs. So if planners could get the economics right, they can do all the placemaking they want, but until they get the basic economics, I think they need to step back.
Very good. Tom, come on in, join the party. What have you got to say? Defend the sort of position that you hold, and, you know, in some respects, do no harm first.
Well, I think as a starting point, new build development is, wherever it is, really less than 5% of the kind of stock, certainly less than 5% of the housing stock every year, near 1 or 1.5%, I think. So if planners are only concentrating on those things and not concentrating on the kind of wider places that's sitting in, they're kind of failing. And I think because the system has the ability to bite and say no, the important point that Jenny made, people therefore tend to focus on that bit, which is about the bite and say no, and we can put these conditions in and we can control that and so on, rather than if someone's proposing a new housing development or a new office development or whatever it might be, we as an authority manage the area around it, and how do we best get it to land, rather than the principle of it and getting into doing hundreds of reports and everything else. So I think that the type of system that Ant's talking about, certainly for the kind of smaller developments, I can see arguments for kind of larger urban extension type things and so on, but for smaller developments, the local authority, it's about, I mean, city management or place management or whatever you want. You can call that planning, or you can call it good city management, and it varies in different countries as to who does that and whether the people who do it call themselves planners. But that would be a much more creative role for planners that I think they want to be doing, rather than spending their whole time doing kind of detailed development management over things that they still only have a marginal influence over.
Yeah, okay, that's a very good point. Very good point. So we've got about 5 minutes. I want to finish with getting your reflections on this sort of the balance between, or the trade-off between, you know, the desire to reform the system because it's not doing, you know, whatever it ought to be doing, versus managing the costs of any type of reform, which there will always be costs. So this is an uncertainty kind of problem that you were talking about, Ant and Tom, in a sense, you know, whilst we are thinking about what things are proposed, they then work through the system, and, you know, things maybe don't happen as efficiently. So, Jenny, start with you on that. I mean, given the, you know, other places and that you've observed, how to manage the uncertainty that any reform, you know, necessarily brings into the system. Is that about being clear about the size of the prize, you know, at the other end? Is that the one way to think about it?
So very few places have done wholesale reform. We're going to tear up the old system and implement something new. In most cases, it's been incremental. And actually, one of the things that I have been pushing for in the US, we have a bunch of states and cities that have passed incremental reforms. So California has legalized duplexes and lot splits and accessory dwelling units. We have not done a great job of monitoring and evaluating these policy changes when they happen to see how effective they are. And we now have a number of different places with different kinds of housing markets that have done different policy reforms. So we have actually a fantastic opportunity to do some really rigorous research and figure out what kind of reforms work, how big of a change in density do you have to allow, is it the procedural reform? And so I think we need to do a better job as researchers to figure out how much more bang for our buck we're getting with various policy changes and use that to build the evidence-based case for what other places ought to be doing.
Yeah, great. That's a great response. And come in on this and tell a sense of how do we think about, revolutionary reform, changing everything. There are going to be costs in the transition. Is the size of the prize worth it? How do we manage that offsetting, the issues through the transition, and get Tom to kind of reflect on that as well?
Yes, I think there's two angles to this. One is that, I think at the very first, there needs to be agreement about what the goals of the planning system are and the goals of what planning system should be. I think among, a lot of planning reformers, I think there's, a consensus we need more planning reform to increase development, increase housing supply, increase access to urban economies. There's not quite a consensus across the entire political debate yet. So I think before we embark on anything bold, we need to make sure we're all on the same page about that. And the New Zealand reforms, as I understand, were passed by both the Labour Party and the National Party in New Zealand, so they got that consensus first. But I think also it sort of depends also where you are on the political cycle, right? So I think obviously one reason why the government is finding it quite difficult to navigate these challenges is we're approaching 13 years of Conservative government. It's quite difficult for governments as they get more advanced into their tenure to pursue difficult and challenging reforms. So therefore, maybe at this stage in the cycle, thinking about kind of policy and incremental reform is more possible. If we get to the start of a new cycle in which there's more capacity for governments to take on bold risks, maybe then we can start thinking about shaking things up a bit more. So I think coming back to the politics as well as the technical aspects is important.
Great. Okay, Tom, give us your sense. On the one hand, as you say, the arguments for incremental reform are there and are clear, but in a sense, if the problem is quite large and growing, does that suggest bigger scale changes need to happen, and there's going to be an inevitable period of uncertainty if we do that? I mean, there's several sort of questions in that kind of vein, Tom. I mean, how do we think that through?
I mean, I think they say that people are most conservative about the things they know most about. So I'm kind of quite conservative about the system because I kind of deal with it every day, and it's there, and you're dealing with the challenges and so on. That kind of metaphor that I used at the beginning about the kind of dinosaur extinction versus marginal gains. Marginal gains was obviously most associated with British cycling, and then we found out that they had therapeutic use exemptions to help them along, also known as drugs. But maybe we need that kind of marginal gains reform, but with some very specific things, looking at some of the aspects that we've talked about that might be radical and trying some of those things. And some of the directions in planning reform at the moment, for example, design codes and those kind of things could, if done properly and not over elaborated again, form a basis for looking at coding for smaller schemes and making things more simple to go through the system. So I think we've got kind of those directions, some of those directions in play, but it's going to take some kind of consistent and thoughtful management through the politics of it to try and make them work.
Brilliant. A great point to encouraging experimentation and variation, but also recognizing the politics is always there and needs to be negotiated. It's 2 o'clock, so we do need to finish, although we could go on. We got loads of questions through. Thank you very much for everybody who put in both their comments and their questions. I tried to take some of the essence of them and get them to our panelists to respond. So I thank you very much for making the time to do that. Also, big thank you to my panelists, Tom and Jenny and Anthony, in terms of the conversation. I think it'll be interesting to see how the reform conversations, even if not the reform itself, happen over the next period as we get towards the end of this parliament and maybe think about what may or may not happen in the next parliament in Britain, at least. So thank you very much to my Panelists, thanks for everybody for joining, and thanks for the comments. Until the next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks very much indeed.